Um, I want to talk just very briefly about new stuff that I learned this semester, and then I want to talk about stuff that we didn't learn enough about. I was most floored, I guess you would say, by Ed Castillo's lecture about the fate of the Native Americans in California during the Gold Rush. I had been aware, of course, that thousands of Indians were killed. I had not been aware in such detail, and I had not been aware of the magnitude, and I had not been aware of the extent of the results. And for me, learning those things to the extent that I now have has fired up my anger and has fired up my resolve to do something about it. It seems to me that we, citizens of the United States of America, have the power, if we wish to use it, to see to it that Native Americans are treated fairly, as they have not been for the past 200 years. And if we put our minds to it and put our work to it, we can get the law changed that gives Indians no right to bring suit for lost property in U.S. courts. I'm going to bend every effort I can to that end. In the course of dealing with Holocaust questions, probably like everybody else who deals with such questions over the long haul, I have asked myself again and again, what are the actual roots of destructive behavior? I want to talk about a root that I think is probably the predominant one, probably more powerful than any other, but which gets too little attention in Holocaust studies, at least to the extent that I have been aware of Holocaust studies, and that was a pretty fair extent by now. Namely, material roots / economic roots. We hear a lot about psychology. Peter Phillips, for example, in his excellent lecture of last week, mentioned that, or emphasized that, what we need to come to grips with if we want to prevent destructive behavior, violence, genocide, war in the future, we have to start with what goes on inside of us. We have to deal with our own fears and our own anger. I agree. But I ask myself, and I ask you, does that fear and anger come up from inside of us, external cause? Are babies born feeling fear and anger? I don't think so. I think that the fear and anger that adults feel, and that often drives them to doing irrational things and destructive things, comes largely from external causes. And if we don't deal with those external causes in some more effective way than we've been able to over the course of human history thus far, we may not be surprised, we have no right to be surprised, if destructive and ultimately genocidal actions continue to take place. Now, in the course of thinking about how people get into things like the Holocaust, genocides, the topic of denial always comes up. I want to point just briefly to one area in which I suggest an awful lot of us are in serious denial. I think our society at large has been trained not to ask questions about where money comes from and how it works. I think that when people don't have money and lack access to the things that money can buy, such as shelter, food, various kinds of security, when people lack other things that are connected with money, like the only time that they feel those things. I'm saying that the kinds of fear, anger, and resentment that flare up into destructive mass behavior come more often than not from a sense of material insecurity. And I want to simply point a thing to you and ask you to, first of all, critique me, because I'm not sure I'm right about this. I'm not an economist, but I've been digging around on this topic, and I think I'm right on it. Maybe some of you know an answer that I haven't hit yet, and if you do, I would appreciate your sharing it with me. If you don't, I would appreciate your pondering, as I am, the implications of this fact. Fact, every unit of currency, by which I mean every dollar, every franc, every pound, every Deutschmark, etc. in the world, comes into existence as a function of bank debt. If you know any other way that currency nowadays, money, gets created besides the issuance of bank debt, let me know. The Federal Reserve System in the United States issues money which needs to be repaid to the Federal Reserve banks. It issues money to the government, it issues money to member banks, and the member banks issue commercial banks, and the commercial banks issue it to their customers, but it's all debt money. That's how dollars enter our economy. That's how dollars get there in the first place, to be circulated. Now, so why is this important? What does this have to do with fear and anger? I maintain that the way money is issued causes scarcity, necessarily, automatically, structurally. That this scarcity is what causes people to lose their jobs and to lose, ultimately, their money, and therefore is a major root of destructive behavior. How does this all happen? If the money that is issued, i.e. every dollar that you've got in your pocket and that everybody anywhere has in his or her bank account, if all of those dollars are issued as debt, as a loan in other words, they have to be repaid. And when you repay loans, under the current system, you have to pay interest as well. But the money to pay the interest with was never issued. You follow me on this? The money that has been issued and is therefore circulating in the economy is debt principal, a loan principal. It has to be repaid with interest, but the money to repay the interest with has never been issued. Therefore, if you're going to pay that interest, you have to take it from somebody else's principal. This is a major source of scarcity. I'm going to leave it at that. There are all kinds of implications to this and all kinds of ideas that people have about ways to change the system so that it doesn't automatically create and promote scarcity. I'm focusing right now on a small scale version of that, which is called local currencies that do not get issued as a result of debt. And there are larger scale implications and larger scale solutions that one can talk about as well, but I don't have time to go into all of that. I do want to emphasize that I think it's time that we address scarcity in the world, material scarcity first and foremost, and I think that until we have dealt better with the scarcity issue than we've been able to, we're pushing deck chairs around on the Titanic when we talk about preventing destructive behavior and genocides and holocausts. Thank you very much.
We have somebody who doesn't want to stand at the podium, which is perfectly all right.
Hi there, I'm Chanel Brown, and I'm in Dr. Beard's class here. And along with what he was saying, one of the things I was most struck by was the fact that economics controls a huge amount of what goes on in our country, and especially throughout the world, because the corporations in this country control so much of the assets in the world. And one of the things that I was really struck by was how that affected things way back when. And what I mean is when Dr. Castillo talked about the Native American experience, he talked about the fact that one of the driving forces towards the destruction of the Indian population was rush. And since then, we can see many, many other examples of how the economics has affected wars in the world and the struggle with power and other things like that. And I think this is one of those important topics that is sort of, it's discussed, but it's not really looked into in depth. And I think that that was one of the main things that I really was concerned about as I heard the lectures in this series and then in other classes as well. Similarly, when Alan Lunin talked about the Bosnian crisis, he also mentioned that he thought that his friends in Bosnia who were aware of the wars and the conflicts had thought that economics was more a problem for the enemies than was religion or ethnicity or any other sort of countervailing factor which we tend to see in our media. And that's something else that I would like to talk about, which is the media. One of the greatest things I think that we have is freedom of speech in this country, yet the actors that operate tend to limit our ability to say what we want to say, and our access to information is sort of, I would say it was sort of hindered by the fact that those in power and those with the money don't want certain stories to come out. They don't want their interest to be hindered because of the fact that they have money vested in all kinds of other little areas. And Peter Phillips did a great job of illustrating that with his Project Censor book, and he used illustrations throughout his lecture to sort of explain how important those factors are within the media and within our sources of information and the avenues that we go about getting our information. One other thing which I sort of came up with as a result of being in this lecture series was the fact that courage and bravery and heroism, things like that, that we sort of tend to think are courageous. I think kinds of qualities are instinctual in human beings, and what I mean by that is that many times people can be heroic and they can be senseless and selfless because they go out and they try to help their fellow human beings. And in that, I don't think that they react from what they know. I believe that they react by instinct, and I don't think that that's something that can be taught. I think that it's something that is innate within human beings, but what happens is many times people deny those human impulses and instead rely on orders from others. They rely on giving away their responsibility and being autonomous. And in that sense, they sort of deny the fact that they're human beings and that they need to help others. I don't know if any of you have ever thought about that, but I tend to think that it's sort of a big clue as to why people can be heroic and why we have rescuers in the Holocaust and why there weren't more. One last thing that I came up with was that the area of conscience is something that we talked about a lot in our seminar particularly, and also the idea of critical thinking. And something that struck me was that it's the same philosophy as the Golden Rule, and it's also a philosophy that Kant had come up with. And what I think is interesting is that the philosophy has been around for thousands of years. I mean, it was in the Bible, and it's still talked about today in the terms of conscience or critical thinking or whatever. But if the idea has been around, why is it that we have Holocausts and genocides, and why is it that people do not follow their conscience, or why is it that they don't follow the Golden Rule? And I tend to think that that's because they're denying their responsibility as humans. I don't think that people really examine the fact that they are responsible for how they treat other people, that it's not just an individual thing, that it's not just a group of people together in one little community, but that it's a larger issue. And to me, that seems like one of the points that was made in this class that I've learned from, and that I think is one of the most important. That's all for me.
Hi, my name is Veronica Dominguez, and I'm in Ilka Hartman's class. I'd like to first of all thank Ilka for a lot of support that she's given as a Native American. I'm sorry. This class has been very meaningful to me because Native American and going to school here, college, a four-year college, I struggle in every single one of my classes because my heritage are never discussed. My multicultural studies class, we don't talk about Native Americans unless I bring that issue up. And it's very hard to try to tie my feelings and my perceptions into our discussions because I know there are a lot of people out there who don't really have an interest in hearing what had happened to us. It's in the past, it's history, it's rarely discussed. And the first time when I saw Lucille Eichengreit talk, she was a really strong inspiration to me because she, even though she was a survivor, she experienced the horrific events that took place in the Holocaust. My grandmother had experienced those things, and therefore our family has never really sat down and talked about it, so I don't know anything about my history except what I've learned from books. and I have to do it by myself. I don't have an instructor or a teacher to guide me, and that's really, really difficult. And I come to this class every day wondering how many of you have experienced something such as myself. And a lot of people that I've talked to in my classes can't remember where I'm coming from, and it's very difficult. So I feel this is a great honor for myself in that I am a Native American, and I hope to be a start to allow our people to come out more and to become educated. It's situations such as these, there's no identity, there's nothing to grasp on to keep your interest, and it's very, very difficult. And again, I thank Ilka for being such a great support to me. After several times after classes explaining my feelings, and she's been very open and very supportive of them. And this class has really taught me how to speak up for how I feel, but not use it against anybody. I just would like to express how I feel, because there's so much there. Just as I was listening to Lucille talk, you could just hear the pain in her voice. After all those years of holding it within herself, I could relate to what she was feeling, because it does hurt and it's very painful. But at the same time, I see more people willing to be open. My class in particular, I want to thank my classmates. We've had some good discussions, and they allowed me one day after Ed Castillo's lecture to actually speak and explain to them how I was feeling, and they were all very open and asked questions, and I explained to them that I like questions to be asked. It's like Lucille says, stands out to me a lot, is how come you never asked? There's always those questions. And I know sometimes people are afraid to ask us people what it's about, because some of us do come out very negative, but I like to just let you all know that I'm not someone who likes to be like that. I like to share my experiences. I like to let you know, because there are a lot of us out there that really want to express that. And so this class has really taught me how to really speak out for myself, because so much of it out there. And I thank everybody for what they've said, because they've made some really good points. And all I ask is that you just kind of step back for a while and look at your position and how fortunate you were as people to be brought up in a good civil life, whereas people like Dr. Steiner or even Lucille, who had to suffer a lot, who were very unfortunate but are still very strong today and sharing their experiences, and that's something that I'd like to do in my future as well. Thank you.
And last night I was at home and I got a call and I picked it up, and it was Ilka begging me to please speak today, for no one had come up in front of the class to participate in this panel. So I was honored that she decided to pick me out of the whole class to call and to express my own ideas and feelings about what this whole series has been for me. I think, first of all, what struck me as very important for all of us was that it brought history to life. No longer was words just a black printed piece of white paper with a couple pictures to look at, but we had feelings, emotions, thoughts, and actions all come out into play in front of us, and in that fact we were able to respond to it and able to incorporate those feelings and ideas into our own lives. So no longer was history just black print words on a piece of white paper, but became part of our own identity, and we're able to act upon history by asking questions. As you already know, I asked many questions. And by asking questions, we were able to begin to do the critical process that many of our instructors wanted us to do, to not take it for granted just as history, but to ask why, and ask, why did this happen? and begin to analyze our own lives and begin to analyze the fact that many of us do live in sheltered lives where we get in our car, drive home, go to work, eat, sleep, go to school. I mean, rarely are we very challenged by a class to not only intellectually challenge a course, but to also emotionally challenge the course at the same time. You can see it brought up many different emotions for many different people, and because of that, we're able to get many different angles on things that we would never really have thought of before. And I think for me, the speech that really hit me the most was the speech given by the basketball coach, because he wasn't an intellectual, he wasn't an academia person. He wasn't a man who'd gone to Stanford or Harvard and traveled, to all the different universities around the world, but he was a man of life in his own eyes. And he was able to express his feelings and thoughts because he had lived life and acted upon what he believed in. He didn't need a book to tell him that, and he didn't need teachers or a Bible to tell him what he thought was right to do. He acted upon it because he critically thought about what he was supposed to do and how he was supposed to act as a human being towards his fellow brothers and sisters. So I think the most important thing that I got out of this class was that we need to not blame the economic, the governments, the societies, or cultures of other people. We need to ask and blame ourselves first by not allowing for this to happen again, and by asking ourselves, what are we doing to help society? Are we doing enough? Or are we just staying in our car and driving home, watching TV, and not living life to the fullest in the sense of not sharing our lives with other people? Thank you.
I'd rather stay there.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's all right.
I don't know that I need that, though. That's fine, if you guys can hear me.
Can you hear? How about the background?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what to say, and I almost think that's the most important thing that I have learned from this. Other than the facts, like the first girl said, the Holocaust to me was a paragraph in a book. I didn't realize they still happened. I don't watch the news much, and when the media says things about Bosnia and Serbia, they call it a war. They don't call it a genocide. So when I heard war, I thought two equal parties fighting each other. That was their own business. I had no concept of what was going on, nor did I really have a full concept of the Holocaust. And anyways, besides the facts, I've learned, I think, the most important thing to do, and I started doing this when I had kids, was questioning myself. I was brought up in a time in a very strict private Catholic school. Your teachers were right no matter what. Your parents were right no matter what. Police, politicians, they were all right no matter what. And without that kind of attitude, maybe some of these things wouldn't happen. I know I need to question a lot of the things I've learned. And I don't know, that's pretty much it. I didn't have a lot of time to sit down and think about this. I wasn't exactly sure what we were even going to do up here. I know a lot of things when I was younger I thought were black and white are not black and white. There are so many shades of gray. And even if you have a very, very strong opinion on something, there still may be other viewpoints. And I think you always need to stop and think about that.
This is really moving to hear your responses. Do you have your hand up?
I just wanted to ask what her name was. Oh, I'm sorry, Kelly. Kelly?
And I want to thank you for taking this time of your studies and of your life to face one of the worst disasters in history of which we know. And I know this is easy for all of you, and the memory of what you have read and what you have heard is also going to stay with you. So I think I really want to thank you for going through this, and also all the ones that participated in bringing this lecture series here, all the people that are not here today. I was thinking to read you something that I read just very recently that is very true. And this is from a book by a Jewish man who came to Germany shortly after the war and interviewed Germans. And since I'm from Germany, this was particularly meaningful to me. And I would like you, while I read this little bit, to please try to think about the society that we live in today, because I think we can learn something from the quotations that the interviewer about the German man who had just finished living in the dictatorship. To live in this process is absolutely not to be able to notice it. Please try to believe me. Unless one has a much greater degree of political awareness, acuity, than most of us ever had occasion to develop. Each step was so small, so inconsequential, so well explained, or on occasion regretted, that I were very detached from the whole process from the beginning. Unless one understood what the whole thing was in principle, what all these little measures someday led to, one no more saw it developing from day to day than a farmer in his field sees the corn growing, and one day it is over his head. How is this to be avoided among ordinary men, even highly educated ordinary people? Frankly, I don't know. I don't see even now. Many times since it all happened, I've pondered that pair of great maxims: resist the beginnings and consider the end. And I think with the lectures that we have heard, this is really one of the lessons that I hope we can all glean from these months that we spent, to see where there are beginnings, or where we are further than the beginnings, in situations where other people's rights are being stomped on, where the planet is in danger. I think that is what we have to learn, and we have to apply it to our time today. We all know that genocides can happen everywhere now, and that they happen all the time in small little steps that we have to become aware of, that nobody can pull the wool over our eyes and say, yeah, but that's not how it is. Don't be exaggerating now. You just always want the negative. That's really not true. Don't bum me out. Let's talk about something else. When we have an instinct about something, we have to follow it, and there will be always more people than we think that will stand with us when we need civic courage to speak up at some small occasion where we think somebody is wronged. There will always be people that will think the same, but are a little bit afraid to say something. So when one of us thinks, the others will gain courage also. And that's what we have to do. In the same book, a man said that he was responsible alone for what happened, because there was a time when he had the choice not to swear the oath to Hitler, the oath of allegiance. And he did swear it because he thought it was the easier step to take. It was easier than losing his job, not being able to support his family. And we always have to consider the result of our actions. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Let me just start with not only an appeal to emotions, but also to your intellect. And it's a combination of both. Now, I think about genocide when you talk about Holocaust. both of these faculties need to be present for us to first of all comprehend, and what we comprehend then translate into action. Because comprehension without action does not change anything. There are some verses in Dante's Inferno. Dante, you probably have heard of Dante, I'm sure, Inferno, well, which came to mind when we think of concentration camps and what happened to the people in concentration camps. So the first thing, which perhaps was the greatest impact on very many, if not most, was the concept that what Dante has expressed in his Inferno in these few verses, you who enter here, let go of all hope. And that's exactly what we experience. Because we still functioned rationally, and because we functioned rationally, we felt it was impossible to get out of that situation alive. And I certainly gave up all my hope, perhaps not spiritually to that extent, but rationally, because I felt absolutely no prayer to leave that situation. So that was the first thought which I thought I'll enter with. The second thing which I'd like to read to you was a short, very short poem written for me by someone in El Cerrito in 1980. And it is entitled Death Camp Metamorphosis. Death Camp Metamorphosis. And it goes like follows. I met your sisters yesterday. So little's left for them to say. They bid you well from Birkenau. Ellie is a tree there now. Valleys made of clay, and Otla I will not say. Now, many of us who survived, and that is precisely what the notion was of that person who has written that short poem, is those who survived have that particular feeling that what happened to all the millions, but not just the impersonal millions, but also those people we knew personally, family, friends, and whatever, who disappeared, who were murdered, and we remained alive without them. And the emphasis on without them. Because for most of us, there has not been any substitute for those we have lost. None whatsoever. And therefore, survivors are very lonely people, and I won't belabor that. Now let's go on to some sort of interpretation of some of the emotions which I may have stimulated. Jean-Paul Sartre said something exceedingly interesting about anti-Semitism, about hatred of people who appear or are in one another different. And I think he captures intellectually exceedingly well what is at bottom of all the prejudice all of us experience in one way or another, because in everyday life we like some people and we don't like some people. So we deal with sympathies and antipathies every day. And we have to come to terms with that, because anything, nature will develop into prejudice, because usually we jump to conclusions before we really have gotten to know that person. So my notion is that before we really develop some more in-depth sympathies as well as antipathies, let's be sure that we find out facts and evidence before we jump to conclusions. And that's a very difficult thing to do, and that's where it all starts. So I'm suggesting to you, try it, because a face, eyes, or a figure, or whatever is not going to be any proof as to what that person stands for or what has happened to his or her life which made him what you see. Alright? And that's where we ought to really start. Now let me come back to Jean-Paul Sartre. And he writes the following, which really was very impressive to me when I read it, because somehow it's a key to a better understanding where this prejudice and all these sort of problems which can escalate into violence, and the violence may escalate into genocide, where it all comes from. And he expressed it very, very, very subtly. So I'm quoting here now. We have now seen that contrary to a widespread assumption, it is not the Jewish character which produces anti-Semitism, but that, on the contrary, anti-Semitism creates the Jew. Are you getting the point, or do you want me to read it again? I don't mind doing that because it's very important. All right. We have now seen that contrary to a widespread assumption, it is not the Jewish character. It's not the Jewish character which produces anti-Semitism. But then on the contrary, anti-Semitism creates the Jew. So what he really is telling us here is that with our prejudices, which is an antithesis, we are shaping the people to whom our feelings or our preconceived notions are addressed. And once we realize that, we can change it. We can change it. So let me continue a bit more on an academic, intellectual level. And when I thought what I'm going to leave you with in terms of my thoughts, which may or may not be of much value, but still, they are my thoughts. I've written the following, which is, again, a little bit social psychological and a little bit social science, sociological. And let me share the conclusion which I have with you in these very few words here. We all, of course, as you know, we all find ourselves all the time in different situations to which we respond. And the important thing is how we respond personally to these situations. What is stronger? The situation in which we find ourselves, or we are strong enough to shape or co-shape that situation. Because if we let ourselves be shaped by the situation, we will be just like a metallic ball in a pinball machine. We'll be simply kicked around by all the forces which are beyond our control. And if that is the case, we are not ourselves. We simply are play balls in situations which we do not influence sufficiently. Why? Because we are sleeping, we are not awake, we are not conscious of what is happening. And in order to stimulate that consciousness, we have to be alert to understand, at least to some extent, how we are being shaped by what forces and how we are co-shaping those forces which appear and very frequently are more powerful than we are. And then it is very important that we really reflect on how we will stand up to them and be accountable, responsible, think about fairness, equity, decency. We will think critically and question authority. Now, one example we've had here, and you've had here when you witnessed the short lecture given by Knut David, he is a person perhaps who comes close to encompass all these sort of things which we call courage, fairness, equity, decency, critical thinking, and the questioning of authority. And I think these are traits which we can develop once we are aware of how we influence others when we are in interaction with them in a given situation. So let me quote myself in what I've written here for the purpose here, the last session of our lecture series. Situations change to people who are responding to them. Only a very few can transcend situational constraints and pressures. These people who can do that will be the heroes of our time and the heroines of our time. The invulnerable, their moral understanding will guide them a path of truth and accountability. And if you can remember it and act accordingly. Because again, to understand is exceedingly important, because without a proper understanding of our action, there is not going to be an evolution. There is not going to be a growth. So first comes the understanding. That's why we're all here in an academic institution. The second step is to have enough courage to act according to your understandings. Because if you don't, nothing, but nothing, is going to change about what we are talking here. So, who have to start with ourselves before we expect others to behave in a way we don't behave. It starts with us. Social change starts with us. Thank you.
It's really interesting to me. For me, personification of what we had to learn this semester was represented by individuals. Lucille Eichengreen, and perhaps her direct emotional counterpart, Herman Schein. Many students saw that difference between the way they approached both their experiences during the Holocaust and their life afterwards. Certainly Alan Lunin was, for me, a remarkable person, just an average citizen who said yes. And once he said yes the first time, was enmeshed in saying yes over and over and over again. Once he said yes, he couldn't say no. That is very likely the same kind of thing that one would see from the person who just, if we think in terms of emotion, who stirs up the most emotion. I think about him, and what happens to me is the same thing that Rob Coleman said about endorphins. Endorphins start to go, and that's nude diving. If we could find a more decent human being, I don't think we could find a more decent human being. As some of you know, I study the resistance movements during the Holocaust, and specifically the Danish resistance. And I would like to challenge you to this. Is nude diving a special form of human being who arises only once in a generation? No. It is my firm belief that nude diving is the product of his society, and he says it himself. That there is a sense, or was a sense in Denmark at that time, that people were to be responsible for each other, and that they were not divided. Now, the situation in Denmark was very, very different than it was. Downtown Copenhagen was not very much like downtown Warsaw. But given the circumstances, there was a large, not all the Danish people, or a large group of people who knew the right thing to do. And many of them knew that because of the way their society places value not on individuals like ours, but on the value of the group. So, many of us may look at nude diving and say, God, he's a hero, he is special, he is unique, his actions work. But I assure you it's the way we describe him and not the way he describes himself. Because like many people who were rescuers, he says, if you remember correctly, he said, well, I just did what wouldn't you do that? It seemed like a normal thing for him to do. So, for me, once again, what I learned to a large extent was embodied in some of the people who came to speak to us. That is the part that I'm looking forward to for next year. Thank you. I would like to open it up to you and give you all a chance, students, a chance to speak into the microphone. We have a long cord.
You were just talking about nude diving in Denmark.
Right.
And from what I've read, there weren't a whole lot of nude divers in Poland.
There were probably more nude divers in Poland than there were in Denmark.
Well, but is my information wrong in that it seems like there were a lot of the population of the
why you have to have the conditions. The culture. But the reason that
Certain countries really did take care of things and they pushed them up. And other countries were quite happy to transport them off, it seems. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. And so I look at the two countries there, and I look at the two cultures, and I'm wondering if there's something there that's telling me, you know, that's of interest.
well, one of the things that's of interest is that if you were defined as a foreign Jew, no matter what country you were in, you went. The French started deporting Polish Jews who had come to France before the Second World War. The Italians didn't give them up. Right. I'm
So it's just, I'm interested in that. I don't have an answer for it. I'm just wondering about it.
And what was unique about Italy and Denmark is that they refused to label Jews.
So, you know, is that cultural again?
Wish I had the answers. Wish I had the answers.
There were Dutch and Belgians who also didn't get Jews.
Right. I mean, we had rescuers and you had perpetrators, but most of the people were bystanders. People who just stood and watched. And I don't think there's enough
I had the option or the opportunity of interviewing Kenneth Divey for our interview, and there was a quote that I had put into the paper that I think might help answer your question. I had asked him, I had said, if you were in another country, would have you done the same thing? And then I went on to ask him too, was that did he feel that other countries should have done more than what Denmark did? And he gave me a very passionate response in that. He said that it is cruel for people to compare what he did and what Denmark did to other people who lived under Nazi regimes, who had to hide people in their apartments for 2 to 3 years, had their own food, medicine, clothing, personal space, and had to risk their own lives because they had a better opportunity of being killed by the Germans. And they did this without question and threatening their lives. So he almost put what he did down and saying, I didn't do anything big because I had the whole community and society supporting me. I had my friends, my neighbors, everybody. He said these people were alone. They had no one to turn to. And that therefore he had much left for rescuers in Poland, Holland, Germany, France, you name it, because they went beyond the call of duty. So
That is the lesson of Denmark, and that was that people did not, even by their turning away, people who didn't help, the bystanders who turned away were rescuing the Jews were also contributing to the rescue, and there were a fair number of collaborators and members of the Nazi Party in Denmark, but a lot less than proportionate.
Yeah, it's actually quite on that topic, but it still centers around Mr. Divey. I think what I, at least to myself, and I hope to a lot of other people here, at least within the lecture series, got out of both Mr. Divey and Mr. Loonan was the fact that each of them, although they both had networks of either be it, the nation in which they lived or the context in which they made of their lives, although they had that help, their individual endeavors, their action produced results. There was a tangible people saved. There was a tangible, lives helped. And I think that it's those results, that sense of utility, of empowerment, that I think is the last hurdle that a lot of well-intended people never clear. A lot of people who do have the knowledge, a lot of people who do know what's going on, know that something more needs to be done on any range topics or what have you. Just the sense that one person can produce something tangible, that there will be a payoff that is quite obvious. I'm not denigrating in any way the moral or personal benefits that doing the right thing can indeed produce. Just when there is something obvious, I think that makes such a difference in determining whether or not something carries good thoughts over into good actions. And I thought that having them here for everybody to see that such results can indeed be produced was very important.
I think we are getting very close to a better understanding. But let me say, just as a suggest, what I have also handed out to you in form of a chart. The Danish people, the Finnish people, Bulgarians, and the Italians to some extent, and some others, did not view the Jews as an outgroup. They didn't treat them as such. And therefore, they're brothers. They're just like themselves. They integrated. To them, it was just a difference in religion, not as different in ethnic or any sort of other way, appearances and whatever. And that, I think, is exceedingly important for us to understand that if we don't cast someone, a certain group of people cast out of into an out-group, then we will treat them very differently. And that's what I've tried to express in my chart. The farther out an out-group is cast, the less we will be concerned with them, and the less we will be prepared to help them. And so what you heard about Poland, those people who were rescuers risked much more than those people who were rescuers in Denmark, for example, or in Finland. Because there was a uniform notion about the fact that they are one of us. So obviously we do what we have to do, which is just simply support them. Poland, on the other hand, or for all practical purposes in what I call Czechia now, Czechoslovakia, former Czechoslovakia, the Republic of Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic. There the situation was very different. Because why? Because anti-Semitism was exceedingly strong. And Jews were not fully integrated in Czech society. And the first president of Czechoslovakia, Thomas Garrick Masaryk, fought that from the very beginning, even before he was president. He fought that particular division and said the Jews are not any different than you are, but what you make of them will make them different. Because you treat them in a way which will make them different. So I think that's an explanation which I think is based on some sociological understanding.
So then you have to ask the question, what was it about those countries that pushed their Jews outside and
Right.
separate? What was it in their culture that was different from the culture
Prejudice.
that accepted them?
Prejudice.
And where did that come from in those
Well, for example, in the Jewish situation, it's relatively Christ killers. All right, to be very specific. Sure, of course.
Yeah, okay.
And they were forced to assume certain occupations, not of their choice, but they imposed on them, and then they were blamed for being moneylenders, because Christians wouldn't do that. See?
There's also a notion of the universe of obligation and who is included in that universe of obligation. And the people who are included in the universe of obligation are the people whose wrongs deserve correcting. And from what I can understand, just about every country where a majority of the Jews were saved, members of the church spoke out early and often. And that happened in Finland, it happened in Denmark, it happened in certain areas of France, not necessarily Catholic. priests who helped save Jews, but also in Protestant
And Germany too.
and Germany as well.
I think tangible results are nice, and I think the broad aspects of what we're all talking about is nice. But I think too that a lot of what I've learned is that if I can't go out and save a group of people myself, financially or get to them or whatever, that at least I can change my attitudes about certain things. I can hopefully raise my children to think about other people better than myself may have learned. Simple things. You don't want to put off doing anything because you can't do something spectacular. And I think that's really important that just by, somebody said, by going home and talking about what we've learned in this class makes a result. My husband and I both think very differently about some things. So it wasn't just me this class affected, it was my husband. And maybe if that's all I can change is my husband and myself, we can raise our 3 kids better. They'll change some of the people around, and hopefully that will do something. Even if I can't go out and get some people or, have that tangible result. It's tangible in a small way in my community.
I'd like to respond by pointing out that how many of you have lived for a significant time in another country? 3, 4. There's an ideology in the United States about the individual. We make it on our own. Each person is responsible for themselves. And I would say to you that if you took a good look at some of these other countries, people do not have that same kind of ideology. Of course we can't do anything if it's all up to us individually. And for me, that's one of the lessons of the Danish example, and that is that people felt connections to each other. It was individuals who did things, but the Yad Vashem has honored the whole Danish nation. It's impossible to find more than perhaps about 40 people who were rescuers, but yet we know that there were thousands of people who contributed in one way or another. So we are somewhat hampered as Americans in looking at solutions to this because we think we all have to do it alone. And that's an attitude that I find increasingly paralyzing for students, because if you think, each one of you thinks that you have to save someone on your own, it's never going to happen. But if we join together in groups, we can do a lot, even if they're just 2 or 3 of us.
I wanted to thank Victoria for her comments, and that it was I felt very lucky to have her in my class and to get her perspective. And that Thursday, spoke to us was one of the Thursdays when I wish we had 2 or 3 hours to talk, because it was very enlightening to learn about that. And at the beginning of the semester, I had known practically nothing about the Native American experiences. And I want to thank you for your input on that. And also, Melanie's speech at the beginning, I agreed with everything you said. And I think one of the best points you made was, what do we do with this information? And also the points of some of the speakers that would talk about an issue like critical thinking or Dr. Thorpe, and then they wouldn't apply it themselves to the Holocaust, but would leave that up to us. And sometimes I wish they had said something just so that I could get their perspective on how they thought it related. But then also now we can go in everything we hear. In every other class, we can say, how does that relate back to the Holocaust? I'm taking a Native American Studies class next semester, and everything I learn, I want to try and relate back in our English classes, in our, every class. Now we can look at the information and, on critical thinking or anything, and relate it back to the Holocaust and how that subject either affected the Holocaust or something. And so I think that it might have been a good thing that they didn't outright say how it related, because now we can look at everything in our life and how does that relate, and how can we learn from the Holocaust, and how can we apply what we're learning in the future to what we learned this semester.
Okay.
I think one of the most important things I learned in this course was, Dr. Steiner, in your lecture, you first introduced the concept of moral integrity, and I began to question my own moral integrity and wondered what I valued. And for me, I value learning, and I think that education is really the only means we can get to full tolerance and peace. So I think that thinking, in a sense, Myrna, does have to begin with the self. You have to hold yourself up to criticism. You have to continually re-examine where you stand on moral issues, and then use Dr. Paul's upon that with Dr. Paul's example of intellectual standards, and incorporate those in your reading and your education and in your interpretations of daily life. For me, that's my legacy. I mean, to those around me, I fully plan on, for everyone who will listen, for me to tell the story that I've learned from this course, and hopefully it'll change their thinking as well.
I didn't particularly mean that we shouldn't try to build ourselves as individuals, but as Americans, we don't have a lot of social contacts. We live driving alone on the freeway in our cars. We don't carpool with people. We don't take public transportation. There's a different sense of communality. That if something were to happen and you were to go outside this building, and stand somewhere in the quad, would you know who you could rely on to do something? Well, I'm not saying that Danes have radar, but there's a pretty good chance that they would not feel the same way, that they would feel as though they could have a communal answer to something.
I, too, aside from the facts that we've learned this semester, like the student that just spoke, have learned to question my own moral integrity and my own opinions on others, of others. And that is the most that I have gained out of this lecture series, which I hope is because of the topic, prevention of genocide, in that change starts within ourselves, and if we can't make that change, how can we expect others to? And I had the opportunity as well to interview a survivor, and one thing that she said to me that was very striking was, she said that if 100 people had protested in 100 cities, it could have been stopped. And I think that that's something that age generation, whether it be an 18-year-old or a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old, we're not willing to stand up for what's right. And that's the thing that I've gained from this semester, is that we have to be willing to stand up for what's right. You can't just be a bystander anymore. It's just not going to make things better.
Myrna was going to give me a few minutes to talk about Native Americans. I spent quite a few hours in Castillo's class, and I've spent much time when I have Native American friends. And from the first day I walked into Castillo's class, and I had to leave the class in the middle of class because I was so angry. My eyes were open. I've learned to search for something which is, I believe, very much valuable, not only to Native Americans, but also to refer to as a dominant society. For us sitting here, all of us, we are the dominant society. And some information I would like to impart to you is that because we are the dominant society, we live in an invisible paradigm when we look, read, discuss, visualize Native Americans. As I studied over the last 6 years about Native Americans, and primarily I did a very in-depth report on Native Americans in this area, the beginning and decline of their population since the first day that the Spanish came until after the turn of the century. I've learned something that's most valuable. And the one thing that's most valuable and that I challenge you to find, look for, whether it comes from a lucid Native American heritage, whether it comes from somebody from Europe, wherever it comes from, we must gather it because it's the most important thing that we can get today, that we can give, that we can offer up to Native Americans. And that is the truth. The unadulterated, complete truth. Because we live in an invisible paradigm, it's hard to distinguish what the truth is. And we have to challenge our instructor. We have to challenge the things that we read. We have to challenge the things that we hear. For example, one day I heard from a Native American friend of mine about the Oklahoma bombing. He said, well, that's too bad. The federal government deserved it. You know? Yeah, but see, the truth is that there were Native Americans in that building. And I knew that because I had seen pictures of Native Americans who came to that building to sing for the Native Americans that had died. So we always must the truth. And I stopped my friend and I told him, I said, you have to look at this article in Time magazine. And you have to see, you have to realize what the Native Americans did. So the truth is important. It goes both ways. And we must always guard the truth. And not allow the ideologies that we've learned in school, that are written in books, that are given to us in the media, the misinformation, to overlay our most valuable thing is to make a judgment, to hear the truth, and ask questions. It's too bad I didn't get the time to tell you the story of the Navajo. But that's a good story. For you those to seek out, that's a very important story. Because in the end of that story, Native Americans, the Navajo, have found a way to sing their sadness and to sing their praises when they dance. And it's in that story.
I've heard a lot of things that sort of ran the bell in summing up the consequences of what do we do after what have we learned. Does the idea that anti-Semitism isn't based on the character of the Jew, but that it makes the Jew how we react. And I just realized that on a slightly different tack, 50 years ago, some people decided they had learned something, and they put their lives on the line, and they created a state called Israel. And I understand that a number of people don't know much about the Holocaust, and there may be just as many people who don't know a lot about Israel. But that was the answer to never again shall this happen. And I'm not sure I can trust that, but that was one answer that people learned from what had gone on. If there had been a state, any state, I understand, was it the Dominican Republic who offered? There was a small nation who offered to take some Jews in after the Weinberg Conference, the Wannsee Conference. But if there had been anyone speaking up, this Holocaust would not happen. It is happening, genocide is happening in nations that are intact. And so while I appreciate the issue of the economy being at the basis of what is going on in Indonesia, for instance, today, there are already 4 students who were shot this morning. It's very troubling that there is a combination of factors that combines into this entity from man to man, and including women, no doubt, if we were in real power situations. So what we're taking away on an individual basis is something we can only practice ourselves and within groups of like-minded people, certainly educate our children. And hopefully in my time there will be peace in the state that among people where it was created because incredible hate for a couple of thousand of years. I don't approve of everything that is happening there today, but it's an incredible thing that a nation was born just 50 years ago and unfortunately had to come out of this kind of a bloodbath.
Okay, Gene. I would like to address my remarks to our Native American student here. In the 15 years that I've been studying this subject and reading a lot, I've come to this question. It's a question, a question and a challenge. Both your people and my people have suffered greatly under the heel of white European society. When I went with a kid in the 4th and 5th grade, they glorified manifestation. I didn't know it meant killing you, your people. That's what it meant, really. In Germany, let and drown. Kill all the people there, we need one room. Okay. Today we have Bosnia, which would have gone to a genocide if there weren't American troops there saying no. And in Germany itself, I know that Bill Beard and John Steiner know this, anti-Semitic parties are gaining in membership. One state election was won by a member of one of those parties. In France, you have 10. So the question is white European society a genocidal society? That's a good question to investigate. There's about 6 PhDs in there.
I think we're probably about out of time, but before we all go, I want to ask you to join me in expressing our appreciation and congratulations to Myrna for having done such a magnificent job of coordinating. Long may she reign.
Buy me a video projector.
$15,000.
Yeah, light one. Make it very light and
Vice versa.